The concrete walls trembled long before anyone heard the guns. Inside a German bunker overlooking the coast of Normandy, a young sentry glanced toward the black horizon. It was just after 3 in the morning on June 6, 1944. Outside, the wind carried the smell of salt water across rows of steel obstacles and tangled barbed wire that disappeared into the darkness. The sea looked empty. Ordinary. Then the horizon began to hum. At first, it sounded like distant thunder. One soldier dismissed it as another passing storm rolling across the English Channel. Another muttered that the British had been conducting night exercises for weeks. False alarms had become routine. Every rumor of invasion had ended the same way, with nervous hours followed by quiet dawns. But this time, the sound did not fade. It grew. Within minutes, every man inside the bunker had stopped talking. The vibration beneath their boots became impossible to ignore. Telephone operators reached for receivers. Observation posts scanned the darkness through binoculars, straining to make sense of shapes that seemed to emerge from the sea itself. The reports arriving from neighboring positions were confused, fragmented, and contradictory. Some believed they were hearing naval patrols. Others insisted Allied bombers had changed course. No one could see enough to understand what was coming. Across occupied France, thousands of German soldiers waited behind what they believed was the strongest coastal defense system ever constructed. Massive concrete bunkers, hidden artillery batteries, minefields stretching toward the surf, and millions of obstacles had transformed the shoreline into a fortress. Month after month, they had been told that if the Allies attempted to invade, they would be thrown back into the sea. The Atlantic Wall was supposed to make such an invasion impossible. Their commanders believed the enemy would strike somewhere else. The narrow waters near Pas-de-Calais seemed the obvious choice. Intelligence reports, intercepted radio traffic, and carefully planted misinformation all appeared to confirm it. Even after years of preparation, many officers remained convinced that Normandy was little more than a diversion, a place the enemy might threaten, but never choose for the decisive assault. It was an assumption shared at every level of the German command. And for a while, it seemed perfectly reasonable. After all, no military force in history had ever attempted to land so many men across such heavily defended beaches. The weather had turned rough. Powerful tides exposed deadly underwater obstacles. German artillery overlooked every likely landing zone. Machine gun nests had overlapping fields of fire. Reinforcements waited farther inland, ready to crush any force that somehow survived the crossing. On paper, the defenders held every advantage. But wars are rarely decided on paper. Beyond the darkness, hidden by fog and distance, an armada unlike anything the world had ever witnessed was already moving toward the French coast. Thousands of ships carried not only soldiers, tanks, and supplies, but years of planning, deception, engineering, and determination. The men packed inside those landing craft could not see the defenders waiting for them. And the defenders could not yet comprehend the scale of what was approaching. Neither side knew that within a few hours, thousands would be dead. Entire units would disappear. Decisions made in isolated bunkers, crowded command rooms, and smoke-filled headquarters would alter the course of the war. Within 24 hours, the beaches of Normandy would become one of the bloodiest battlefields in modern history. Within weeks, Germany's grip on Western Europe would begin to unravel. Within a year, the Third Reich itself would cease to exist. Yet this is not simply the story of the largest amphibious invasion ever launched. It is the story of the men ordered to stop it. Young conscripts who had never fired a shot in combat. Battle-hardened veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front. Officers forced to make impossible decisions with incomplete information. Engineers who believed concrete could defeat determination. Commanders separated by conflicting strategies, delayed orders, and dangerous assumptions. Each would experience June 6th from a perspective rarely explored, not as the liberators arriving from the sea, but as the defenders watching history emerge from the horizon. Because battles are not remembered only by those who win them. They are also remembered by those who stood in the path of forces too immense to fully understand. And before the first Allied soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy, the fate of D-Day had already begun to unfold in the silence inside those German bunkers, where one unanswered question still echoed through the darkness. What if the impossible was no longer impossible? For months before dawn ever broke over Normandy, the German soldiers stationed along France's northern coast lived with an uneasy certainty. They knew an invasion was coming. They simply believed they knew where. From the windswept cliffs overlooking the English Channel to the quiet villages tucked behind the beaches, construction never truly stopped. The sound of pouring concrete echoed day and night. Giant bunkers rose from the coastline like gray fortresses carved directly into the earth. Steel doors were bolted into place. Massive naval guns were hidden behind reinforced walls. Trenches linked one defensive position to another until miles of coastline had become a maze designed for a single purpose, to make any Allied landing impossible. To the men defending it, this was more than a line of fortifications. It was a promise. The promise that no enemy could survive what awaited them. One German engineer remembered watching train after train arrive loaded with cement, steel beams, rolls of barbed wire, and prefabricated obstacles. Entire forests disappeared as timber was cut for bunkers and firing positions. Every beach was carefully studied. Every possible landing site was measured. The Atlantic Wall was not built overnight. It was the product of years of labor involving hundreds of thousands of workers across occupied Europe. But despite its intimidating appearance, the Atlantic Wall hid a dangerous weakness. It was never truly finished. Some sectors were protected by enormous concrete bunkers capable of surviving heavy bombardment. Others relied on hastily dug trenches, aging artillery pieces captured from conquered nations, and small groups of exhausted soldiers. Along certain stretches of coastline, experienced veterans stood watch. In others, teenagers and older reservists carried rifles beside foreign conscripts who spoke little German. From a distance, it looked like one continuous fortress. Up close, it was a patchwork of strengths and vulnerabilities. No one understood this better than Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Having witnessed Allied air power devastate German forces in North Africa, Rommel reached a chilling conclusion. If the Allies successfully landed, Germany would almost certainly lose the battle. Allied fighter aircraft controlled the skies during daylight. Every road, bridge, and railway could be attacked within minutes. Large German formations moving toward the beaches would become easy targets long before they reached the front. Rommel argued that the invasion had to be destroyed at the water's edge. Every minute mattered. Every meter of beach surrendered would make victory less likely. He ordered millions of mines planted across the coastline. Steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with explosives, and underwater obstacles were positioned to rip apart landing craft as the tide rose. Flooded fields were created inland to trap airborne troops. Beaches that had once welcomed fishermen and tourists became deadly killing grounds. Many soldiers respected Rommel because he visited them personally. Unlike distant commanders who issued orders from headquarters, he walked through muddy trenches, inspected bunkers, and questioned junior officers directly. He noticed missing ammunition. He criticized weak defensive positions. He demanded improvements wherever he went. But not everyone agreed with his strategy. Far from the beaches, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt believed Germany's strongest armored divisions should remain inland. Instead of scattering tanks along the coast, he wanted to launch a massive counterattack after the Allies revealed their true landing site. In his view, the panzer divisions were too valuable to risk in isolated coastal battles. The disagreement created a dangerous divide. Who would control the tanks? When should they move? And who had the authority to make that decision? The answers remained tangled in layers of military bureaucracy and Adolf Hitler's personal control. Several elite panzer divisions could not move without his direct approval. It seemed like a minor administrative detail. Soon, it would become one of the most consequential delays of the entire campaign. Meanwhile, life inside the coastal defenses settled into an exhausting routine. German soldiers spent long hours repairing storm damage, replacing washed-away obstacles, cleaning weapons, and watching an empty sea. Patrols marched across beaches littered with mines. Engineers checked demolition charges. Radio operators monitored endless reports that rarely led anywhere. At night, searchlights swept across dark water only to reveal drifting waves. False alarms became common. One evening, distant aircraft triggered a full alert. Nothing happened. Another week, naval activity across the channel convinced several commanders the invasion had begun. Again, nothing happened. After months of repeated warnings, many soldiers stopped believing each new alarm. The greatest danger had become waiting. Even intelligence seemed to support their confidence. German analysts remained convinced the main Allied invasion would strike the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. It made perfect military sense. The crossing was shorter. Supply lines would be easier to maintain. Heavy bombings in that region appeared to confirm the theory. Unknown to them, the Allies had spent months feeding this belief through one of history's most successful deception campaigns. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, fabricated headquarters, and double agents all reinforced the illusion that Normandy was merely a distraction. Every new piece of evidence strengthened Germany's confidence in the wrong conclusion. For the soldiers standing watch in Normandy, this misunderstanding offered quiet reassurance. If an invasion came here, they reasoned, it would only be a diversion. The real battle would happen somewhere else. As spring turned into early summer, another obstacle appeared to protect them. The weather. Strong winds battered the channel. Heavy clouds rolled across northern France. Rough seas crashed against the beaches, making any large amphibious operation seem increasingly unlikely. German meteorologists predicted that conditions would remain poor. Many officers believed no commander would risk landing thousands of men through such violent water. On the evening of June 5th, some senior officers even left their headquarters for military exercises or personal commitments. Rommel himself traveled back to Germany, believing the weather made an invasion impossible for several more days. The coastline remained on alert, but not on edge. The soldiers settled into another cold night, believing tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Across the channel, however, nearly 7,000 Allied ships had already begun moving through the darkness. Inside them were more than 150,000 soldiers waiting for a signal that would change history forever. Along the beaches of Normandy, the defenders still watched an empty horizon, completely unaware that the largest invasion force ever assembled was already sailing toward them. Just after midnight, the silence began to fracture. The first reports did not come from the beaches. They came from the sky. A German sentry near the village of Saint-Mire-Église looked upward after hearing the deep drone of aircraft engines. At first, he assumed they were German bombers returning from a mission over England. The sound was familiar, almost comforting. But within moments, the engines multiplied until the night itself seemed alive. Hundreds of aircraft were crossing the channel. Then thousands. Searchlights stabbed into the darkness, sweeping across low clouds as anti-aircraft batteries erupted into life. Tracer rounds climbed into the sky like glowing rivers, but there were simply too many targets. The roar overhead became deafening, shaking windows and rattling bunker walls across Normandy. Inside command posts, telephones began ringing all at once. Aircraft approaching from the northwest. Large formations. Unable to determine destination. No one yet understood what they were witnessing. Then came the parachutes. White canopies blossomed against the moonlit sky, drifting silently toward fields, orchards, and villages. German soldiers fired upward instinctively, their machine guns stitching lines through the darkness. Some paratroopers were hit before they ever touched the ground. Others landed miles from their intended drop zones, scattered by heavy clouds and fierce winds. But something seemed wrong. Reports flooded headquarters describing paratroopers landing everywhere at once. Some officers claimed entire divisions had descended behind German lines. Others insisted the enemy was attacking from every direction simultaneously. In reality, many of those paratroopers were nothing more than cloth dummies. The Allies had dropped hundreds of decoys, rubber mannequins fitted with small explosives and noise-making devices. As they landed, hidden charges detonated, creating the illusion of firefights across vast stretches of Normandy. Loudspeakers attached to some dummies even broadcast the sounds of marching troops and gunfire. German patrols raced toward these false landing sites. Precious hours were wasted chasing soldiers who did not exist. Confusion became the Allies' first weapon. Meanwhile, the real airborne troops were already moving. Small groups of American and British paratroopers gathered in the darkness, often without officers, maps, or even a clear understanding of where they had landed. Yet their mission remained unchanged. Capture bridges. Destroy artillery. Cut communications. Prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. They did not need to defeat the German army. They only needed to slow it. Across Normandy, explosions echoed through the countryside as demolition charges ripped apart railway lines and bridges. Telephone poles crashed into muddy roads. Field cables that connected German headquarters were severed with wire cutters in the darkness. Soon, commanders discovered they could no longer reach neighboring units. Messages that should have taken minutes now required motorcycle couriers racing through unfamiliar roads under constant threat of ambush. Every delay deepened the uncertainty. Inside one German headquarters, officers gathered around large situation maps covered with colored pins. New reports arrived faster than they could be processed. Enemy parachutists north of Carentan. No. South of Cannes. Correction. Near the Murderette River. Another message interrupted before anyone could verify the first. Then another. And another. The map became a maze of conflicting information. No one knew which reports were real. Some commanders feared the invasion had already begun. Others believed this was merely another diversion designed to distract from the true landing at Pas-de-Calais. The deception that had fooled Germany for months continued to shape every decision. Farther inland, German reserve units received contradictory orders. One battalion was told to move west. Hours later, it was redirected east. Another remained in place, awaiting confirmation that never came. Every commander hesitated, worried about committing his men against what might be a phantom attack. The uncertainty spread upward through the chain of command. At the highest levels, another problem emerged. Several armored divisions remained under Adolf Hitler's personal authority. Without his approval, they could not launch a full counterattack. But Hitler was asleep. His staff refused to wake him. The belief that Normandy was only a diversion still lingered inside headquarters. If this proved to be a feint, releasing Germany's most powerful armored reserves too early could leave the real invasion force free to strike elsewhere. So they waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. Along the Norman coast, the soldiers inside bunkers knew nothing of these political calculations. They only sensed that something enormous was unfolding beyond their view. The night grew brighter as distant fires illuminated the horizon. Isolated firefights erupted across fields where scattered airborne troops clashed with German patrols. Church bells rang in frightened villages. Civilians peered cautiously through shuttered windows as gunfire echoed from every direction. One German corporal later recalled the strange feeling of fighting an enemy he could barely see. Every hedgerow seemed to hide paratroopers. Every shadow appeared to move. Every unfamiliar sound raised the fear of another ambush. Sleep became impossible. As the hours crept toward dawn, exhausted radio operators continued sending desperate messages through overloaded networks. Engineers struggled to repair damaged telephone lines, only to discover they had been cut again farther down the road. Dispatch riders disappeared into the darkness, uncertain whether they would reach their destinations. The carefully organized German defensive system was beginning to unravel, not because it had been overwhelmed by superior numbers, but because it had been thrown into uncertainty. The Allies had understood something vital. An army that cannot communicate cannot think. An army that cannot think cannot react. And an army that cannot react, no matter how strong its fortifications, is already beginning to lose the initiative. Then, just before first light, a lookout standing atop a coastal observation bunker rubbed his tired eyes and stared toward the English Channel. At first, he thought the pale shapes on the horizon were low clouds catching the dawn. But they kept growing larger. Far too large. Far too many. What was emerging from the morning mist was not another patrol. It was the greatest invasion fleet the world had ever seen. The first light of dawn revealed a sight that no German soldier on the Normandy coast had ever imagined possible. The sea had disappeared. Where there had been only dark water a few hours earlier, the horizon was now covered by ships. Battleships. Cruisers. Destroyers. Landing craft. Transport vessels. Minesweepers. Hundreds became thousands, stretching so far across the English Channel that they seemed to merge with the morning sky. For a few stunned seconds, no one spoke. The men inside the observation bunkers simply stared. One German officer lowered his binoculars, convinced his eyes had betrayed him. Another demanded that the lookout check again. Surely no navy in the world could assemble a fleet of that size without being detected. But the reports arriving from neighboring positions confirmed the impossible. The invasion had begun. Telephones rang frantically inside coastal headquarters. Enemy fleet sighted. Large formations approaching Omaha. Additional ships off Gold Beach. Enemy vessels across the entire horizon. Each message sounded more unbelievable than the last. The nightmare Germany had spent years preparing for was no longer a possibility. It was sailing directly toward them. Deep inside one concrete battery overlooking the coast, artillery crews rushed to their guns. Ammunition lockers were thrown open. Massive shells, each weighing hundreds of pounds, were rolled toward waiting breaches. Powder charges followed. Every movement had been rehearsed countless times. Now there would be no second chance. Nearby, machine gun teams climbed into firing positions overlooking the beaches. Mortar crews checked their range tables one final time. Riflemen peered through narrow firing slits carved into reinforced concrete, trying to identify which landing craft should be targeted first. Some men crossed themselves. Others quietly unfolded family photographs before placing them back into their uniforms. No speeches were given. There was only work. Then, at precisely the moment many defenders expected to fire the first shots, the sea answered first. Without warning, the battleship guns opened fire. The sound was unlike anything most German soldiers had ever experienced. It was not a single explosion but a continuous wall of thunder. Massive naval shells screamed overhead before crashing into cliffs, bunkers, and artillery positions with terrifying force. The earth itself seemed to explode. Concrete dust filled the air. Telephone poles snapped like twigs. Entire sections of trench collapsed beneath falling debris. Windows shattered miles inland as shockwaves rolled across the countryside. One bunker survived a direct near miss, but everyone inside was thrown violently to the floor. The lights failed instantly. Dust poured through ventilation shafts, turning the air almost impossible to breathe. For several minutes, many defenders could do nothing except endure. Outside, the carefully constructed Atlantic wall was disappearing beneath fountains of earth, smoke, and fire. Some artillery batteries managed to return fire, sending shells toward the Allied fleet. But identifying individual targets through smoke and sea spray proved incredibly difficult. Even successful hits barely slowed the armada. Every damaged ship seemed to be replaced by another moving steadily toward the beaches. The bombardment continued. Then came the aircraft. Hundreds of Allied bombers crossed overhead in carefully timed waves. Their mission was simple: destroy anything the naval guns had missed. Bombs tumbled from the sky, hammering crossroads, strongpoints, bridges, and suspected German headquarters. Fighter aircraft followed, attacking vehicles and anti-aircraft positions with machine guns and rockets. The defenders had prepared for an invasion from the sea. Instead, they were being attacked from every direction at once. Yet despite the overwhelming firepower, something unexpected happened. Many of the strongest German bunkers survived. Their thick reinforced concrete absorbed incredible punishment. Although shaken and isolated, numerous machine gun nests remained operational. Hidden artillery positions continued firing whenever the smoke briefly cleared. The Atlantic wall was wounded, but it was far from destroyed. Then, through the drifting smoke, the first landing craft appeared. Rows upon rows of small vessels moved steadily toward the shoreline, pitching violently in the rough water. Packed shoulder to shoulder inside them were Allied soldiers who had spent hours crossing the channel knowing many would never reach land. German observers watched in disbelief. The invasion force seemed endless. Every wave that emerged from the smoke revealed another behind it. An officer inside a bunker overlooking Omaha Beach gave the order every defender had been waiting months to hear. Hold your fire. The landing craft continued closing the distance. 800 meters. 600. 400. The machine gun crews tightened their grip on the triggers. Artillery spotters adjusted their sights. Mortar teams waited. No one fired. The enemy needed to come closer. Closer still. Then the order echoed through the bunker. Fewer. Fire. Dozens of machine guns erupted simultaneously. The beaches exploded into violence. Streams of bullets slashed across the surf as artillery shells landed among tightly packed landing craft. Mortars burst above advancing infantry. Some boats were struck before their ramps ever opened. Others exploded after hitting hidden mines beneath the water. Along parts of Omaha Beach, entire sections of the first assault wave were cut down within minutes. German soldiers watched landing craft drift helplessly after their crews had been killed. The rising tide carried bodies back toward the sea. Smoke covered the shoreline as burning vehicles and shattered obstacles littered the water's edge. For a brief moment, many defenders believed everything they had trained for was happening exactly as planned. The Atlantic wall was holding. The beaches had become killing grounds. Officers reported heavy Allied losses. Machine gun barrels glowed from sustained fire. Ammunition carriers rushed fresh belts to exhausted crews. Some defenders even allowed themselves a dangerous thought. Perhaps the invasion really could be stopped. Perhaps the enemy had underestimated German defenses. Perhaps Normandy would become the graveyard of the Allied armies. But hidden beyond the smoke, something the defenders could not fully see was beginning to change the battle. Small groups of Allied soldiers were finding gaps. Naval destroyers were moving dangerously close to shore, firing directly into German strongpoints that had survived the initial bombardment. Combat engineers were clearing obstacles under relentless fire. Tanks that managed to reach the beaches began engaging bunkers one by one. The first cracks were appearing. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough to matter. Inside the bunkers, German commanders noticed something troubling. Positions that had been reporting regularly over the telephone had suddenly fallen silent. Some artillery batteries stopped answering altogether. Others reported ammunition shortages after hours of continuous firing. The carefully connected defensive network was slowly becoming a collection of isolated strongpoints, each fighting its own battle. Outside, the beaches were still covered in smoke. The gunfire remained deafening. And despite the terrible casualties, the Allied soldiers kept coming. Wave after wave. Boat after boat. Man after man. The German defenders had survived the greatest naval bombardment in history. But now they faced an enemy that refused to stop advancing. And before the morning was over, they would discover that holding the beaches was only the beginning of a much more desperate fight. By mid-morning, the battle had settled into a brutal rhythm. The deafening roar of the naval guns had become almost constant. Smoke drifted across the beaches in thick gray sheets, occasionally parting just long enough for German machine gunners to spot another wave of Allied infantry struggling through the surf. Every few minutes, another landing craft scraped against the sand. Some never reached the shore. Others opened their ramps into walls of gunfire. From inside the bunkers, it appeared that the invasion was collapsing. At Omaha Beach, German defenders watched American soldiers pinned against the narrow strip of sand between the sea and the bluffs. Bodies and wrecked equipment littered the shoreline. Engineers trying to clear obstacles were cut down almost as soon as they began their work. Tanks intended to support the assault disappeared beneath the waves after rough seas swamped their landing craft. One German non-commissioned officer later remembered looking through his binoculars and thinking that no force on earth could survive such punishment. Again and again, Allied soldiers tried to move forward. Again and again, they fell back under relentless fire. For the defenders, years of preparation finally seemed justified. Every obstacle they had placed, every bunker they had reinforced, every firing lane they had measured was producing exactly the outcome they had envisioned. Officers sent optimistic reports to higher headquarters, claiming the beaches were becoming graveyards for the invading forces. Some even believed victory was only hours away. Yet beneath that confidence, small warning signs were beginning to appear. A machine gun crew reported that one of its barrels had overheated after firing almost continuously since dawn. Ammunition belts that had seemed more than adequate during training were disappearing with alarming speed. Runners carrying fresh supplies found themselves exposed to naval shellfire and Allied snipers, turning even short journeys between bunkers into deadly missions. The defenders were winning, but they were paying a price. Meanwhile, the Allied commanders offshore refused to accept defeat. Reports from the beaches painted a grim picture. Casualties were staggering. Entire companies had lost their officers within minutes of landing. Landing craft drifted aimlessly after being struck by artillery fire. Radio operators struggled to establish communication as bullets ripped through antennas and equipment. For a brief moment, some naval officers wondered whether parts of the operation should be abandoned. But the order never came. Instead, smaller groups of soldiers began making decisions on their own. Without waiting for formal commands, junior officers, sergeants, and even ordinary infantrymen searched for any route that might lead beyond the beaches. They crawled through shell craters, hugged the base of the cliffs, and slipped into folds of the terrain that German defenders could not easily observe. The carefully planned assault had begun to transform into hundreds of small, desperate battles. This change was almost invisible from inside the German bunkers. They could still see men falling. They could still hear machine guns dominating the shoreline. What they could not see were the scattered groups slowly working their way toward the bluffs. One American officer later described the situation with brutal simplicity. There were only two kinds of men on that beach. Those who were dead, and those who were about to keep moving. That determination began to alter the battlefield. Far offshore, Allied destroyer captains watched the stalled landings through binoculars. They realized that if the infantry remained trapped on the beaches much longer, the invasion might indeed fail. Ignoring the enormous risk, several destroyers steamed dangerously close to the coast. So close, in fact, that some sailors worried the ships would run aground. From these new positions, their guns no longer fired at map coordinates. They fired directly at individual German bunkers. Each salvo crashed into the cliffs with terrifying precision. Concrete splintered. Observation posts collapsed. Machine gun nests that had survived the earlier bombardment suddenly found themselves under concentrated naval fire from only a few thousand yards away. Inside one bunker, the lights failed after a near-direct hit. Dust filled every room. The shockwave blew steel doors off their hinges. Survivors emerged disoriented, unable to understand how the ships had moved so close without being destroyed. Elsewhere, German artillery crews faced another growing problem. Communication. Telephone lines had been severed repeatedly during the night by Allied airborne troops. Motorcycle couriers struggled to navigate roads now under constant air attack. Orders that once took minutes now required hours, if they arrived at all. Some batteries continued firing long after neighboring positions had been knocked out because no one informed them of changing conditions. Others remained silent, waiting for instructions that would never come. The Atlantic Wall had been designed as an interconnected defense. Now it was becoming a collection of isolated strongpoints, each fighting alone. The pressure increased with every passing hour. Above the battlefield, Allied fighter aircraft patrolled almost unchallenged. Any German vehicle moving in daylight risked immediate attack. Columns attempting to approach the beaches were forced to hide beneath trees, wait until darkness, or abandon roads entirely after repeated airstrikes. One panzer commander later recalled that reaching the front became more dangerous than the battle itself. Every crossroads seemed to attract bombs. Every bridge invited rockets. Every movement carried the risk of destruction from an enemy that controlled the sky. Yet despite these growing difficulties, many German soldiers refused to retreat. In bunker after bunker, small garrisons continued fighting even after being surrounded. Some artillery crews fired until their final shells were exhausted. Others switched to rifles and grenades as Allied infantry closed the distance. For many defenders, surrender never seemed like an option. They had been ordered to hold their positions. And they intended to do exactly that. By early afternoon, however, the reports reaching German headquarters had become impossible to ignore. Enemy troops had breached portions of Omaha Beach. British forces were advancing inland from Gold and Sword. Canadian units had secured footholds at Juno. The invasion had not been thrown back into the sea. It was growing. Still, hope remained. If the armored divisions could launch a coordinated counterattack before the Allies consolidated their beachheads, perhaps the situation could still be reversed. German commanders looked anxiously toward the roads leading to Normandy. They waited for the sound of tank engines. They waited for the arrival of reinforcements powerful enough to drive the invaders back into the channel. Hour after hour passed. The tanks did not come. Far away, decisions delayed by uncertainty, conflicting authority, and rigid command structures were preventing Germany's most powerful weapon from entering the battle when it mattered most. On the beaches, the defenders were still fighting with extraordinary determination. But for the first time that day, many began to realize a painful truth. Courage alone could not replace reinforcements. And as the Allied foothold slowly expanded beyond the sand, the battle was no longer about holding a single bunker or a single stretch of coastline. It was becoming a race against time. A race Germany was beginning to lose. As the afternoon wore on, the battle changed in a way that could not be measured by the number of bunkers still standing or the amount of ammunition left in a machine gun belt. It changed because time was no longer on Germany's side. From the first reports before dawn, German commanders had believed they still had one decisive advantage. The Atlantic Wall was never meant to defeat an invasion entirely on its own. Its real purpose was to delay the enemy long enough for powerful panzer divisions to arrive, launch a crushing counterattack, and throw the invaders back into the sea. That was always the plan. Hold the beaches. Bring in the armor. Destroy the beachhead. Simple in theory. Disastrously complicated in reality. Nearly 100 miles from the fighting, telephones continued to ring inside German headquarters. Maps were covered with fresh reports, many of them contradictory. Some officers insisted Normandy was the main invasion. Others remained convinced it was only a diversion designed to draw German reserves away from the Pas-de-Calais. The deception that had fooled Germany for months refused to die. Even now, with thousands of Allied soldiers fighting on the beaches, some commanders believed the real attack had yet to come. It was exactly what the Allies had hoped for. 4 weeks before D-Day, fake armies, inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, false radio traffic, and carefully controlled double agents had convinced German intelligence that the decisive landing would occur farther east. Now those lies were buying precious hours. Every hour mattered. Because every hour allowed more Allied troops to come ashore. At the center of the crisis stood a problem that no soldier on the beaches could solve. Several of Germany's elite panzer divisions could not move without Adolf Hitler's personal authorization. During the night, senior officers debated whether to wake him. Some argued that the reports were too uncertain. Others feared committing Germany's strongest armored reserve against what might still prove to be a feint. No one wanted to make the wrong decision. So they waited. By the time authorization finally came, the most valuable resource in warfare had already been lost. Time. The delay would haunt German commanders for the rest of the campaign. When the first armored columns finally began moving toward Normandy, they entered a battlefield unlike any they had faced before. The roads looked peaceful from a distance. Then the fighter bombers appeared. Allied aircraft circled constantly above northern France, searching for anything that moved. A single column of tanks, trucks, or fuel vehicles could attract rockets, bombs, or strafing attacks within minutes. Drivers abandoned roads to hide beneath trees. Vehicles scattered into fields. Progress slowed to a crawl. One German tank commander later recalled that the greatest enemy was not another tank. It was the sky. Every mile toward the front became a gamble. Every crossroads became a target. Every bridge risked destruction before it could even be crossed. Fuel shortages made the situation even worse. Years of war had stretched Germany's logistics to the breaking point. Allied bombing campaigns had devastated rail networks, damaged refineries, and disrupted transportation across occupied Europe. Delivering ammunition, spare parts, and gasoline to Normandy became increasingly difficult. A tank without fuel was nothing more than a steel bunker. A truck without gasoline carried no supplies. An army without logistics could not sustain a counterattack. Meanwhile, the Allies were doing exactly what German planners had feared most. They were pouring men and equipment onto the beaches faster than the defenders could eliminate them. Landing craft arrived one after another without pause. Bulldozers cleared exits from the beaches. Combat engineers removed mines and obstacles. Portable harbors, planned months in advance, would soon allow an endless stream of vehicles and supplies to reach France. German officers watching from surviving observation posts could scarcely believe what they were seeing. Every ship that unloaded seemed to be replaced by another. Every destroyed vehicle was followed by several more. The invasion was no longer hanging by a thread. It was gaining momentum. Inside the remaining bunkers, reality became impossible to ignore. Telephone lines were dead. Neighboring strongpoints had fallen silent. Some artillery batteries had exhausted most of their ammunition. Others had been isolated by advancing Allied infantry. Machine gun crews that had dominated the beaches in the morning were now firing in several directions at once, defending against soldiers approaching from inland as well as from the shoreline. The Atlantic Wall had not collapsed in one dramatic moment. It was being dismantled piece by piece. One bunker. One trench. One crossroads at a time. Still, resistance remained fierce. Near several beach sectors, small groups of German soldiers launched local counterattacks despite overwhelming odds. Some advanced with assault guns and a handful of infantry, hoping to drive isolated Allied units back before they could organize. For brief moments, they succeeded. A hedgerow was recaptured. A crossroads was retaken. An artillery position was briefly restored. But each success was temporary. Naval gunfire answered almost immediately. Allied aircraft appeared overhead. Fresh infantry continued arriving from the beaches. The German attacks lacked one essential element. Coordination. What should have been a massive, synchronized counteroffensive had become a series of isolated actions carried out by exhausted units with little communication and even less support. One officer later admitted that they were no longer fighting as an army. They were fighting as scattered pockets of determination. By late afternoon, the psychological toll began to weigh heavily on the defenders. The confidence that had filled the bunkers at sunrise had faded. Many soldiers still fought with extraordinary courage, but they now understood something their commanders had tried to avoid admitting. The Allies were not leaving. Each hour that passed made their position stronger. Every beach exit opened another path inland. Every captured village created another staging area. Every surviving landing craft delivered more soldiers than Germany could replace. The defenders looked toward the horizon one final time. The sea was still full of ships. It seemed endless. Some men who had begun the day believing they would repel the greatest invasion in history now watched fresh enemy formations arriving faster than they could count. For the first time, many allowed themselves to think the unthinkable. Perhaps this battle could no longer be won. Yet even as hope faded along the beaches, another battle was already beginning beyond them. Normandy was a landscape of narrow lanes, ancient villages, and thick hedgerows that turned every field into a natural fortress. The Allies had secured a foothold. But breaking out into France would prove far more difficult than landing on its shores. For Germany, the fight for the beaches was ending. The fight for Normandy was only just beginning. As evening settled over Normandy, the sound of battle did not fade. If anything, it grew heavier. The beaches that had been soaked by the tide at dawn were now crowded with thousands of Allied soldiers, vehicles, ammunition crates, medical stations, and makeshift command posts. Landing craft continued shuttling back and forth across the channel while engineers worked relentlessly to clear wreckage from the shoreline. From the German perspective, the impossible had happened. The Allies had not only landed. They had stayed. Throughout the day, countless German officers had expected the invasion to break apart under the weight of machine gun fire, artillery bombardments, and fierce local resistance. Instead, every hour had brought more men, more tanks, more supplies, and more ships. The battle was no longer being fought to prevent a landing. It was now being fought to contain an enemy that was growing stronger by the minute. Far behind the beaches, German commanders struggled to assemble an organized defense. Roads were jammed with retreating vehicles, supply convoys, and scattered units trying to reach the front. Military police attempted to restore order, directing traffic through villages that only hours earlier had been quiet farming communities. But every movement attracted attention. Allied reconnaissance aircraft circled overhead, reporting German positions almost as quickly as they appeared. Fighter bombers attacked bridges, crossroads, and convoys with relentless precision. One surviving German officer later described daylight movement as almost suicidal. "If you could see the sky," he recalled, "the sky could already see you." It was a new kind of battlefield. In earlier campaigns, German commanders had relied on speed, fast-moving armored columns, rapid communication, swift concentration of force. The strategy had overwhelmed Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Union during the early years of the war. Normandy was different. Every attempt to move quickly was slowed by destroyed bridges, bombed railways, cratered roads, and constant attacks from the air. The very tactics that had once made Germany so dangerous were now working against them. Meanwhile, along the beaches, Allied engineers transformed chaos into organization. Bulldozers carved new exits through embankments. Military police directed traffic away from the shoreline. Medical teams established field hospitals only a short distance behind the front. Fuel dumps, ammunition depots, and communication centers appeared with astonishing speed. German observers could scarcely believe how efficiently the invasion force adapted. This had never been intended as a single day's battle. It had been planned as the opening move of an entire campaign. Throughout the evening, isolated German strongpoints continued fighting. Some bunkers held out until darkness. Others resisted well into the following day. In several places, defenders refused repeated demands to surrender, choosing instead to continue firing until ammunition finally ran out. Their determination was undeniable. But determination alone could not change the strategic reality unfolding around them. One by one, those strongpoints were bypassed. Rather than attack every bunker head-on, Allied troops often advanced around them, leaving isolated defenders cut off from reinforcement or escape. For soldiers inside those positions, the realization came slowly. The battle had moved past them. They were no longer defending the coastline. They were defending islands of concrete surrounded by enemy territory. Many would fight until capture became unavoidable. Others attempted desperate breakouts under cover of darkness. Few succeeded. Elsewhere, German armored units finally reached parts of the battlefield. But they arrived too late, and in too few numbers. Instead of launching one coordinated counteroffensive, they entered combat piecemeal, attacking isolated sectors while Allied naval guns, artillery, and aircraft concentrated overwhelming fire against them. Individual crews fought with remarkable courage. Some tanks broke into Allied positions before being destroyed. Others delayed advancing infantry for hours. Yet every local success was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the invasion. For every German vehicle knocked out, more Allied armor continued arriving from the beaches. For every defensive line established, fresh infantry extended the Allied perimeter. The balance of the battle had shifted beyond recovery. As night fell, German headquarters finally accepted what many frontline soldiers had already understood. The invasion was not a diversion. Normandy was the main attack. The realization came with devastating consequences. For months, some of Germany's strongest formations had remained positioned near the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Even after D-Day, Adolf Hitler remained convinced for several days that another, larger landing might still occur elsewhere. Those precious divisions waited for an enemy that did not exist. It was one of the greatest strategic victories of the Allied deception campaign. The battle had been influenced not only by bullets and bombs, but by belief. As June 6th came to an end, the German army had not been destroyed. Far from it. The fighting in Normandy would continue for weeks, becoming one of the most bitter campaigns of the Second World War. Every hedgerow would become a battlefield. Every village would change hands. German soldiers would continue resisting with determination, inflicting heavy casualties as the Allies fought their way inland. But something irreversible had happened on that first day. Germany had lost control of the initiative. The Atlantic Wall, once presented as an impenetrable fortress stretching across occupied Europe, had failed to achieve its one essential purpose. It had not stopped the invasion. For the men who survived inside the bunkers, June 6th ended not with dramatic speeches or decisive victories, but with exhaustion. Many had because no wall can stand alone. Concrete cannot replace communication. Mines cannot replace mobility. And courage cannot replace coordination. The commanders faced their own painful lessons. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had warned that the battle would be decided on the beaches during the first hours of the invasion. He understood that once Allied air power and naval supremacy came into play, every delay would strengthen the attackers and weaken the defenders. His prediction proved devastatingly accurate. By the time Germany's armored divisions entered the battle, the opportunity to destroy the beachheads had already slipped away. The decisions made in distant headquarters echoed louder than the guns fired on the sand. Some orders came too late. Some never came at all. Others were based on assumptions carefully planted by Allied deception. History is often remembered through moments of extraordinary bravery, but D-Day also reminds us of something less visible. Wars can be won long before the first shot is fired. Months before June 6th, Allied planners had assembled not just an invasion fleet, but an entire system designed to overwhelm every weakness in Germany's defense. Intelligence officers misled enemy commanders. Engineers developed specialized landing craft and portable harbors. Meteorologists searched for a narrow window of favorable weather. Aircrews isolated the battlefield by destroying roads, railways, and bridges. Every branch of the Allied war machine worked toward a single objective. The soldiers on the beaches were the final step in a plan years in the making. For Germany, Normandy marked the beginning of an irreversible decline in Western Europe. Within weeks, Allied forces broke out from the beachheads and pushed across France. Within months, they reached Germany's borders. Less than a year after D-Day, the Third Reich had collapsed, and the war in Europe had come to an end. But to understand D-Day only through the lens of victory is to miss part of the story. From the German perspective, it was a day of impossible decisions. Young sentries who had expected another false alarm suddenly faced the largest invasion fleet in history. Machine gun crews fought until their barrels glowed red. Medics treated friend and foe alike amid collapsing bunkers. Officers struggled to lead without reliable communications, uncertain whether the reports reaching them reflected reality or deception. Many fought with determination. Many died believing reinforcements were still on the way. Many never learned that those reinforcements would arrive too late. And that brings us back to the quiet bunker overlooking the sea before dawn. A young sentry had stood there listening to a strange sound rising and fought continuously for nearly 24 hours. Their ears still rang from naval bombardments. Their uniforms were coated in concrete dust and smoke. Their weapons were worn from constant use. Some searched for missing comrades. Others waited for orders that never arrived. Many simply stared toward the sea. Even in the darkness, ships were still visible. Their lights stretched across the channel like an endless city floating on the water. It was then that the scale of what had happened truly became clear. This was not merely another amphibious assault. It was the arrival of an industrial power unlike anything Germany had ever faced. Every ship represented more fuel, more ammunition, more tanks, more food, more engineers, more aircraft, more soldiers. The defenders had spent years building walls of concrete and steel. The Allies had spent years building an unstoppable system of logistics, planning, deception, and coordination. On the beaches of Normandy, those two visions of warfare collided. And by the end of June 6, 1944, the outcome was becoming impossible to ignore. The battle for the beaches was over. The battle for France had begun. And with it, the final chapter of Nazi Germany's war in Western Europe was set into motion. When the guns finally began to fall silent, Normandy did not resemble a battlefield that had been won. It looked like a world that had been shattered. The beaches were scarred by shell craters. Burned-out landing craft rested in the surf where the tide slowly pulled at twisted metal. Concrete bunkers that had once symbolized German confidence now stood cracked and abandoned, many still filled with spent ammunition, broken equipment, and the personal belongings of soldiers who would never return. Across the countryside, villages lay in ruins, fields were torn apart by explosions, and the quiet roads of Normandy had become pathways for one of the largest military campaigns in history. For the German soldiers who survived June 6, the war did not end when the sun set. In many ways, it had only become more desperate. They withdrew from shattered strongpoints into the maze of Norman hedgerows, where every field became a new defensive position. Some units fought for weeks without proper rest, food, or reinforcement. Others found themselves surrounded, cut off from headquarters, relying on rumors instead of orders. The confidence that had existed before dawn was gone. In its place was the growing realization that they were no longer defending a coastline. They were trying to slow the advance of an enemy that seemed impossible to stop. For many, the psychological blow was greater than the military one. They had trusted the Atlantic Wall. They had believed the invasion could be contained. They had been told that no army could successfully cross the English Channel against Germany's defenses. Yet they had watched thousands of Allied soldiers come ashore despite everything placed in their path. The walls had not failed because the men defending them lacked courage. They failed from the darkness. At first, it seemed like distant thunder. Then it became the engines of thousands of ships. By sunrise, he was watching history emerge from the horizon. What he could not know in that moment was that the sound rolling across the English Channel was more than an invasion fleet. It was the sound of a turning point. Not because one army lacked courage, Not because another possessed perfect plans, but because modern warfare had entered a new era, one in which logistics, intelligence, air superiority, industrial power, and coordination could overcome even the strongest fortifications. The Atlantic Wall was built from millions of tons of concrete and steel. The force that broke it was built from preparation, deception, cooperation, and relentless determination. That is the deeper story of D-Day. Not simply the triumph of one side or the defeat of the other, but the moment the illusion of an unbreakable fortress gave way to the reality that no defense is stronger than the strategy designed to defeat it. Because in the end, history did not remember the walls that stood against the tide. It remembered the tide that changed history forever.